Good evening. I'm Ciaran O'Reilly, Producing Director of the Irish Repertory Theatre.
And I'm Charlotte Moore, Artistic Director of the Irish Repertory Theatre. Welcome to Yeats Gonne, Echoes Over Time.
The title of our evening reflects the works of two extraordinary writers who have two new books just published. The Fascination of What's Difficult, A Life of Maud Gonne by Kim Bendheim.
And Yeats Now, Echoing into Life by Joseph M. Hassett. We are pleased and honored to welcome both authors.
So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to our host this evening, Mr. Rufus Collins. Rufus has appeared in many productions at Irish Rep and owns a passion for all things Yeats and Gonne.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rufus Collins.
Good evening and welcome, lovers of W.B. Yeats and friends of the Irish Repertory Theatre. And thank you, Charlotte and Ciaran, not only for entrusting me with the job of interviewing these two wonderful authors whose books will be the focus of this evening's program, but also for giving me the opportunity to return to the poetry of Yeats, whose genius seems particularly relevant in these times. The first interview will be with Jo Hassett, whose book Yeats Now, Echoing into Life. And the second will be with Kim Bendheim, and we will hear about her book, The Fascination with What's Difficult, A Life of Maud Gonne. Also, both interviews will be interspersed with recitations of Yeats's poetry. Four wonderful actors, five including Ciaran, read 9 poems on the stage of the Irish Rep a few weeks ago. It's hard to overstate just how moving it was to be back on stage, and on that stage in particular, a year practically to the day from when the theaters were closed. The life-affirming presence of actors and the words of Yeats. It was a wonderful occasion which Rory Duffy, actor, filmmaker, and company member, filmed and edited. So to get started, we're going to hear an early love poem, The Song of Wandering Angus, read by Terry Donnelly. And then Jo will join me after the first reading. Here we go.
I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
Rufus, good evening to you.
Congratulations on the publication of your marvelous book, Yeats Now, Echoing into Life. Before we talk about the book and the poetry, let me ask you how Yeats became so central to your life and how you developed such a kind of deep love and fascination with his life and work.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rufus, for hosting this, and thanks to the Irish Rep, to Charlotte and Ciaran for really creating what strikes me as an extraordinary evening. I've had the pleasure of hearing the actors perform, is really the only word to describe what they do, perform these poems. And it's really an extraordinary experience. Well, it was a good luck, really, that introduced me to Yeats. It was the luck that came from some far-sighted people in my hometown of Buffalo who created a scholarship to send students over to Ireland for summer study. And I had the good luck to be the recipient of one of those scholarships and to attend the Yeats Summer School in Sligo, Ireland, after my junior year of college. And it was really an amazing experience. A Yeats poem I've always felt, and felt from that moment, kind of grabs life by the lapels and shakes it, because he's constantly inquiring into his life and into our lives, and wondering, as his poems do, how does it happen that we're here on this planet? And were we somewhere else before? Are we going somewhere else later? Is there some world of the spirit that's surrounding us and affecting us in some way? And then putting all that aside, how do we live? As Yeats says, the poets, we sing among our uncertainty. How do we live in this uncertain world?
So with that in mind, Joe, let me ask you, the subtitle "Echoing into Life" it touches on a line of Yeats, but tell us why you chose that in particular and what its importance is to you.
Well, it's interesting that Yeats himself wrote a couple of poems about echoes, and the notion of an echo is important to him. But he also made this interesting observation in prose that a lyric can acquire a second beauty, passing, as it were, out of literature and into life. And it seemed to me that he had in mind the lines from his poems, and it's often a line or two as opposed to the whole poem, that captures something important about some life situation that either articulates what we would like to feel about a circumstance or articulates a view on life that we may challenge and then articulate our own counter view. So I had the idea of Yeats living in the tower that he lived in for summers during the middle of his life, which had a winding stair, which is the winding stair on the cover of the book. And on a volume of Yeats' poems called The Winding Stair, the great designer Sturge Moore designed a winding stair that mimicked the winding stair in Yeats's tower. And we have done a kind of a pastiche of that on the cover to this book. So my thought is that Yeats is up in his tower writing these poems, and they're coming down the winding stair, and they're echoing into life.
Now, Yeats said that a poet's life is an experiment in living. And do you think that in a way that his was it a sort of retreat to the winding stair? Because shortly I'd like to play The Second Coming. And with your title, Yeats Now, you've mentioned the relationship of the pandemic of 19 and our pandemic and the sense of the First World War. And the tower is he sort of took himself out of the action and into a kind of private space.
Well, I think in a way that the poem "The Second Coming" is a kind of a lead up to another poem that he wrote in the tower. The Second Coming is very interesting because it was written in 1919, 100 years prior to COVID-19 appearing here in our own lives. And Yeats's father and his wife both had a close brush with death because of the flu they incurred, having gotten the Spanish flu of 1918. So Yeats had a very troubled sense of where he was in his own life when he wrote this poem, The Second Coming.
Why don't we hear it, Joe, and then talk about it again after we hear it. So if you can cue it up, James, we'll hear it read by Sarah Street, and we'll talk about it again together after hearing it.
Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand? Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere, in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank, pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast! Its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born.
So please share with us your thoughts about that poem and how it relates to Yeats's own life and potentially how it may be meaningful to us today.
Well, Sarah's reading of that poem is so thought-provoking. I love the way she reads it. She's kind of piecing her way along and trying to understand it as she reads it. It's a beautiful reading of the poem.
It is.
It reflects, I think, kind of the background of the poem is that whereas the Victorians believed in the idea of progress, that everything was getting better all the time, Yeats was a believer in a cyclic theory of history, that things were up and things were down, and the poem kind of traces the notion that one cycle began with Zeus's rape of Leda in the form of a swan, and then 2,000 years later there was the birth of Christ, which was an influx of a peaceful kind of a spirit as opposed to the violence of the 2,000 years previously. And writing in 1919, he was foreseeing that in the year 2000 there'd be another influx of violence, and therefore he's asking the question, and what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. That notion that there's some violent thing coming in the future, and interestingly, foreseen about a century before the COVID-19 and a century before our own era of plenty of violence, is an interesting example itself of the cyclic nature of history. And I think that the rough beast, in a way, can be thought of, and I think Yeats probably thought of it, as the germ of hatred, which is the same idea, I think, that lies behind another great work of literature that I've been thinking about in these COVID times, is the Camus novel, The Plague, La Peste. Mm. Whereas many people read The Plague as being the germ of hatred that led to the evils of World War II and all the things that went on in France in connection with World War II. Mm. And the kind of the conclusion of Camus' novel is so interesting in terms of Yeats's poem, because his conclusion is almost as though it's an inoculation against that hatred that's going to return. And if I could,
well, it's interesting because with the sense of a revelation being at hand, even if there's a rough beast of hatred, there does seem to be some sort of hope that the new cycle there'll be a sort of a purge of hatred. You brought my attention to the line, feeding on fantasy. And that seemed to be kind of incredibly relevant to today's to today's problems. And maybe you could share your thoughts about that line and how prescient Yeats was to coin that phrase.
Well, it's interesting that Yeats went from that 1919 poem where the rough beast is being contemplated to just 3 years later, in 1922, he found himself in the midst of the Irish Civil War. And he was isolated in his tower out in the west of Ireland. That's the tower that had the winding stair. And he wrote a poem called The Stairs Nest by My Window, which has a great line in it that kind of grasps what we've been facing the last year, where he says, we are closed in with the key turned on our uncertainty. Very interesting that 100 years ago, he had that same feeling that we all have now of uncertainty. Well, as he was closed in with his uncertainty, he wrote later in a note that he said, I had an overmastering desire not to become bitter, not to lose all sense of the beauty of nature. And he said that as that thought was in his mind, two things happened. One, a stair, which he says is our west of Ireland name for a starling, started to build a nest in a empty crevice outside my window. And at the same time, he said, I began to smell honey in a place where no honey could be. Honey historically is a symbol of sweetness and of light. And so out of that, Yeats wrote the poem, The Stairs Nest by My Window, which closes with these lines, which I think you're right, Rufus, have a tremendous bearing on our life today. As we face the same kinds of hatred born out of fantasy in our own life, and those lines, which are really worth dwelling on, I think now, are the conclusion of that poem, which goes this way. We had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmity than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. So those to me are words to live by in our own circumstance, where we've fed our heart in our own country on a lot of fantasies, and our hearts have grown brutal. And these lines are well worth echoing into our lives today.
Yes, beautifully said and beautifully recited, by the way.
I'm not going to try to go into competition.
No, but you're living with them for such a long time. It comes through. So I want to tell our viewers that one of the interesting things about your book is that you've organized it sort of by ideas and themes. The theme of, or the idea of friendship, and friendship in the poems and in Yeats's life, and in love and in work, and rather than any sort of chronological or historiographic. So it means that your sensitivity and great knowledge and insights about the poems themselves comes through in an absolutely beautiful way. I would love to be able to, talk to you about it for a month. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to leap ahead a little bit, and we're going to hear, and we can talk about it in advance, Among School Children, but not all of it. It's a long poem, also read by Sarah Street, and particularly with focus on the last stanza, which has the line, labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul. So why don't we hear it and come back and discuss it together once we've heard the recitation.
What youthful mother, a shape upon her lap, honey of generation had betrayed, and that must sleep, shriek, struggle to escape, as recollection or the drug decide, would sink her son, did she but see that shape, with 60 or more winters on his head, a compensation for the pang of his birth, or the uncertainty of his setting forth. Plato thought nature but a spoon that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things, Solider Aristotle played the taws upon the bottom of a king of kings. World-famous, golden-thighed Pythagoras fingered upon a fiddlestick or strings what a star sang and careless muses heard. Old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. Both nuns and mothers worship images, but those the candles light are not as those that animate a mother's reveries, but keep a marble or a bronze repose. And yet, they too break hearts. Oh, presences that passion, piety, or affection knows, and that all heavenly glory symbolize. Oh, self-born mockers of man's enterprise. Labor is blossoming or dancing, where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. Oh, chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? Oh, body swayed to music, oh, brightening glance. How can we know the dancer from the dance?
Another absolutely extraordinary reading. So one of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the sort of pedal tones in your book is the idea of Yeats encountering what you call threshold occasions. One of your chapters, The Moment Alive. And in this poem, where he starts the 60-year-old public smiling man and ends in this sort of reverie, of a kind of transcendence that has to do with labor and the references to the Greek philosophers. Share with us a few thoughts about how the poem moves toward the great lines, which are sort of philosophical, but they're also about the distinction between poetry and the mysteries that poetry alone can sort of access or attempts to access.
Well said, Rufus. Well, it's interesting. I think of this poem in two contexts, really. And one is that notion of labor is blossoming or dancing, or can be. And that notion runs throughout Yeats of, in one of the poems I talk about in the book is the kind of bracing injunction. The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. And yet, on the other hand, labor may be blossoming or dancing. And he says in a poem referring to his friend Lady Gregory that she so changed me that I learned to live laboring in ecstasy. So I think one of the things that's going on in that poem is the notion that labor can be pleasurable, can be ecstasy. The other thing, as you say, Rufus, is the intense focus on kind of philosophical traditions. Particularly, I love the notion, and it's so beautifully read by Sarah, Plato's notion that there's a world of pure form somewhere outside our own, and that we just see the shadow of that world. Things here are just echoes or shadows. And he sums that idea up so beautifully by saying Plato thought nature but a spume. Spume, is the foam that flits along the top of a wave. So he says Plato thought nature but a spume that plays upon a paradigm of things, the pure form outside our world. And I think having set up that, and a great golden-thighed Pythagoras, who thought that the number was the ultimate reality, played upon a fiddlestick or strings. He found music in the metrical relationship among numbers. I think he's setting up for us the idea that one can think about our world as being parallel to a world of pure form, of pure things, of timeless world. And that kind of gets summarized at the end with the notion of the inside and the outside being the same, the knower and the known being the same. And I think that's one way of reading those beautiful last lines is something that Yeats says in his philosophical work of Vision. He talks about a dancer. He says the perfect embodiment of modern culture, dancing a primitive dance and knowing both that he or she is dancing and knowing the dance. It's kind of the outside world and the inside world coming together. The world we live in day to day coming together with the world of pure form that is outside our world. And we in our normal lives are split between knower and known. But the dancer gets into an ecstatic state where the knower and the known come together. And so the question at the end is both a question and an answer. How can we know the dancer from the dance? Well, one way is by learning to live laboring in ecstasy, which can be done in part through poetry.
Yes, and in a way, it's a kind of answer to the philosophers. The answer, in a way, is this ecstasy and the sense of the presence, and maybe his point, one might say, is that you can't know the dancer from the dance entirely because they are one and the same when they're joined in that degree of intensity. It puts me in mind of a quote that you include in your book from Stefan Collini, who you write that he classifies poets with mathematicians, logicians, and sprinters as specialists in intensity. And I thought there's great wit there, that the idea of a poet and a sprinter being in the same category is charming.
Well, it's in a way what a poem tries to do in that moment of intensity. See if I can remember from the Yeats poem of Vacillation, when he says he was sitting on a street and gazed, and for a moment my mind blazed. It was so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. And he finds, and we can find, and I mean, maybe the subtext of a number of these poems is that one can find in ordinary day-to-day life those moments when for 20 minutes more or less I was blessed and could bless it. A moment of intensity where you can experience your life maybe in relation to something outside your life, the way the dancer and the dance merge together.
Beautifully said. Let's turn to one of the great poems, and one which is going to be read by Colin McPhillamy, Sailing to Byzantium, and talk about that when we're back together.
That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations. At their song the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium, O sages, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make with hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium, of what is past or passing or to come.
Not bad. So it just so happens that that was the first Yeats poem that I was introduced to as a high school kid, and it kind of caught my attention and has stuck with me ever since. But one of the things that you and I discussed, and I found extremely interesting, was the power of the rhetoric of the word "unless." I mean, the poem has a lot of amazing phrases that if you know the poem are extraordinary. But there's also the sense that the meaning of the poem, the story of the poem, turns on the use of this word "unless." Unless soul clap its hands and sing.
Well, it is interesting, and one other thing that's fascinating from that beautiful, startling reading is that a poem can convey something to us without our understanding every word or feeling we have a complete intellectual mastery of some idea. And one of the thoughts behind my book is that a line like the one we're talking about, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless, as it did with you, gets your ear, because even when you're not an aged man, insight comes to you that you're not going to live forever. You wonder, are you merely the equivalent of a tattered coat upon a stick? Or is there something else you can do? Unless, so that poem says, that's what you are, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing. Now for Yeats, that was writing the poem. And in a comment that he made about that very poem, Sailing to Byzantium, he said that Byzantium symbolized for him the spiritual life or the creative life. And I read the soul clapping its hands and singing as engaging in whatever form of creativity might suit the reader. And in the book, I have Richard Diebenkorn's etching a coat. He did a series of etchings of a coat. Toward the end of his life, he knew this poem by heart, and he recited these lines. And I think that the way he let his soul clap its hands and sing by doing what was created for him, which was these etchings, the beautiful etchings of the coat. And so I think that the poem is an invitation, as you say, Rufus, to focus on that word "unless," and to ask yourself, are you going to be the tattered coat upon a stick, or are you going to try the unless? It's
Right.
kind of the unless is really whatever you would like it to be.
And you called it, when we were thinking, you called it, you actually said it was a call to the spiritual world. And I think the sort of music of the poem begins to become sort of incantatory, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing. There's a kind of sense of momentum coming away from the tattered coat that builds up. And then again, the the singing masters of my soul. So the idea of singing somehow begins to pervade the language of the poem.
Yeah, and if you wanted, you could gloss that further with the interesting thought that Yeats was a great student of William Blake, and he knew of Blake's writing that when Blake's brother died, he said, "I saw his soul leaving his body, clapping its hands and singing." So that's a kind of an interesting little bit of background to what I do think is fair to say, that the unless is a call to open yourself in some way to what one might call the spiritual life, which doesn't have to mean religion. It can mean the world of the spirit, the world of creativity, the world of something outside your own consciousness.
Well, Joe, I can't recommend this book enough to our viewership. It is absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful object as well. And I want to say that it's where it's available. It's published by Lilliput Press in Dublin. But where can our viewers get it?
I think the best way for the moment is on bookdepository.com, which gets it to you pretty quickly and without exorbitant postal charges. It's going to be on Amazon, but probably not till summer. Amazon.com. It's on Amazon in the UK now, but they don't ship here. But bookdepository.com.
Okay. And so, Joe, next time we talk about Yeats, let it be in person. And I'm looking forward to it. And I would love to be able to go on. We have Kim to talk to as well, and other poems. So for now, I'm going to thank you and bring you back to say goodnight when we've spoken to Kim.
Thank you, Rufus.
Thank you so much, Joe. Our next guest is going to be Kim Bendheim, who's written this marvelous book about Maud Gonne, The Fascination with What's Difficult, A Life of Maud Gonne. And we're going to hear a poem, The Fascination with What's Difficult, read by Ciaran O'Reilly before we interview Kim. So let's have that, please.
The fascination of what's difficult has dried the sap out of my veins and rent spontaneous joy and natural content out of my heart. There's something ails our colt that must, as if it had not holy blood, nor on Olympus leaped from cloud to cloud, shiver under the lash, strain, sweat, and jolt, as though it had dragged road metal. My curse on plays that have to be set up in 50 ways, or the day's war with every knave and dolt, theatre business, management of men. I swear before the dawn comes round, I'll find the stable and pull out the bolt.
Hello, Kim.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Yes.
And congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful volume, which is about the life of Maud Gonne. Someone who we know, most of us who know Yeats's work, as we know her through Yeats's poetry. We know her as the great object of Yeats's love and unrequited love to a large extent. But you've taken on to, as you say, wrest her away from the poet's idealizing clutches. And how did that start? How did you originally become interested in Maud Gonne, and how did it evolve toward this marvelous volume?
Well, in college, I wrote my thesis on John Millington Synge. And when I lived in LA, I was doing freelancing, and I was writing book reviews for a monthly Irish publication based in LA. And I wrote a book review of the Gonne Yeats letters, 1893 to 1938. And I was really taken by Maud's voice, especially one letter where she was predicting the horror of World War I, and that it was like nothing that had ever come before. And then she said in this letter, which I'll just, is, could the women who are after all the guardians of the race end it? I always felt that the wave of women's power was rising. The men are destroying themselves and we are looking on. I feel like that is still apt, you know? So
Right.
I got caught up, and also she was kind of funny and irreverent, you know?
Right. But then you didn't then immediately get a book contract and turn out the book then. You
No.
lived with it. So tell us a little bit about your experience with Maud's descendants and how you actually came to, you know, undertake to write a whole book, which is a great challenge.
Well, Ireland, as I'm sure everyone knows, is quite small. And when I went there, I made a new friend by going to a play. And I told her of my interest in Maud Gonne, and it turned out this friend, Sheila, was friends with Tiernan, who was friends with Anna White, who had edited this wonderful volume of her grandmother's letters. So I met Anna White. And then I had in the back of my mind that this would be an interesting subject, you know, the whole obsession. Yeats proposed to Maud Gonne four times. And when she turned him down the last, he proposed to her daughter. And was there a love relationship or was it a friendship, and how it endured and shifted over time was interested me. And then, you know, many years later, at a holiday party, I met the man who would become my editor. He said he thought that it sounded like a good idea for a book, and that after the holidays were over, I should call him and we should have lunch. And we did. And I sent him only a 4 single-spaced proposal, which I understand is not usual.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me a contract, and then I wrote it in 2 years.
Well, that was relatively quick, given how long it often takes to write a book. You know, there are several things about Maud that I learned from your book, which I thought were particularly interesting. One of them was that you know, her family, that her mother died when she was only 5 years old.
Correct.
And that must have had a tremendous influence on her, and that she had a close relationship with her father, who was stationed in Ireland, but that the sense of her being Irish was extremely tenuous. If there was any real Irish connection of her blood, it was a number of generations back. Yes?
Yes.
Yes, and that also that she was born into one of the wealthiest families in England.
At the height of empire.
At the height of empire. So the sense that she took up the cause of Irish nationalism and became a great, you know, she hated her own origins in a way, is extraordinary. She eventually sort of accepted this moniker, which her lover suggested to her, the Irish Joan of Arc. Yes?
Yes.
And you've described her as a kind of myth maker, a kind of someone who sort of created a persona for herself and lived it to the full.
Yes, I think that's accurate. She was very conscious of her image, and newspapers were in abundance around the turn of the last century. And she made use of all this modern technology to get out the story of how the Irish were suffering under the British rule. And somehow she related her own great loss of her mother to the loss of Irish people from that their mother Ireland was suffering, and what could be done to help her. You know, all the people she saw evicted, even a generation after the famine, there was still tremendous suffering and unemployment in Ireland while Ireland was shipping and paying taxes to Britain. So she took it on as her own, sort of the way Princess Di appealed to people who were even AIDS patients and held their hands. I mean, Maud went and fed people who were evicted and organized, you know, informal soup kitchens, among other things.
Yes. So why do you think, how did it come to be that she and Yeats met and had such an important and conflicted relationship? One of the things that you describe in your book is that Yeats didn't know for a very long time that she was a mother, and she hid from him, presumably, these important facts about her life, so that potentially she could maintain the idea of a sort of somewhat virginal figure, which in those years was, I suppose, important. But you've described her as complicated, and that certainly seems complicated, that she sort of hiding her children away, including a child that she lost with an older lover. Say a few words about that relationship and how, and in a way, you know, Yeats's idealization of her was something she must have wanted to maintain in some way.
Well, it was also Victorian England. And on top of that, they were Irish and Irish Catholic. You know, it was very much a patriarchy. And women who had children out of wedlock were, you know, totally stigmatized and shunted and ostracized from society. So she didn't tell Yeats that she had a French lover who was married and 16 years older and a right-wing French politician. She kept it secret from him. And when she did finally tell him about Lucien Millevoix,
yes,
he kind of freaked out. You know, they were both creatures of their time.
Yes. Well, let's hear "When You Are Old and Gray," which is a wonderful poem, which is it really reflects his obsession with her and his suffering in a way for her. I mean, she really became for him a kind of a Laura or a Beatrice. So there was a kind of a spot for the unreachable, and right. the siren song of Maud. You know, someone was going to fill that role, and it was Maud. I think it's fair to say she was beautiful, and she dressed beautifully, and she had a kind of allure. So let's run that one. It's going to be read by Obi Abili, who's a company member, and we'll talk about it together afterward.
When you're old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false and true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead and hid his face amid a crowd of stars.
So, do you think that Yeats is sort of accurate when he says that love fled, or is this sort of a poetic conceit that comports with the idea of the poet as a suffering lover?
Well, in his memoirs, Yeats wrote about how he was a suffering lover and sexually frustrated by her and walked the woods at cool and but another thing that Joe brings up in his wonderful book is that Yeats' friendship was very important to Yeats. He thought of the people that writing his poems, he was writing them to friends. And with Maud Gonne, even though they had this wacky relationship, there was an enduring affection and respect. So that if his love went in and out for her, in the end, it was still there.
So it's sort of amazing to think that as a young man, he wrote this poem which imagined her old, and he wasn't sort of far off, because they did maintain a friendship, and a kind of his obsessive love, I think you've said, became sort of evolved into a true friendship.
Well, they had a lot in common. They wanted Ireland they wanted to revivify Irish culture and Irish language and Irish myths.
Yes.
And they were not always lofty. They took, Yeats turned her on to hash. He called it the dream drug. They wanted to see visions of a magnificent Ireland before England had gotten to it.
Yes. Yeah. Now, didn't she say that in a way, sort of to soften and to pacify him, that how did she describe his poems? Almost as though they were.
She said they were their his poems were their children.
Right. I mean, it's quite. I mean, she puts herself center stage there, because a lot of his poems are not about her, but certainly his. I think if she had said yes, I think we would be a lot poorer from the perspective of poetry, even if he might have been happier. Let's hear another one, which is also about his frustration and his struggle to come to terms with being rejected. And that is No Second Troy, and also read by Obi Abili.
Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would have late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or held the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a Titan bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why? What could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn?
Wonderful. Was there another Troy for her to burn?
She did, in another poem, he writes about the hatred and violence that she espoused against the British, and but she also could be, she told him flat out that she'd make him a terrible wife. She wasn't domestic, and that he made beautiful poems out of his unhappiness. And he also came to the conclusion in one of his poems that if she had been obtainable, he wouldn't have spent all that time on words and letting words obey his call.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
she said pretty much that she did him a favor by not accepting him.
Right. Right.
And a great gift to Ireland.
Yes. So talk a little bit about one of the topics of your book is her activism, her as a suffragette, and all the various things that she achieved that have been sort of overshadowed by her role in Yeats's work. It's filled with fascinating detail. One of the complications and difficult issues is that her first lover, Lucien Millevoye, was an anti-Semite and an anti-Dreyfusard during the Dreyfus affair. And it's something that she herself seems to have adopted or did adopt. And you know, there was anti-Semitism, but she didn't seem to ever overcome it. It was an odd kind of blot on her record.
Well, I mean, I would argue that, even though we're in the middle of cancel culture, that you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And she did do much good. She lobbied for the rights of Irish political prisoners and for the human rights of people in jail. She sold the last of her jewels to feed Dublin school children who were, when their fathers were on strike, and the Dublin financiers and factory owners wouldn't accept them back. I mean, so she did, and her son ended up being a co-founder of Amnesty International. And I think that the whole of her life should be looked at. But I'm also was amazed, as I told you, that she was a lifelong anti-Semite. 20 years after the Dreyfus affair, she wrote a letter to Yeats about, that when he was a Dreyfusard, she thought of Dreyfus as a bothersome little Jew or something, quite words to that effect. So there's no way to sugarcoat her, and other biographers have sort of sidestepped the issue, but I think it's part of the whole picture of the woman. And even though I'm Jewish, I thought it was still worth it to grapple with that and find the fascinating threads of her life and Yeats's life. And
yes, well, you certainly did. You certainly have, Kim. Let me ask you to conclude. Yeats had I think, especially for his time, he had a sort of particular feeling for women. He had friendships with women that were deep and genuine, and those are reflected in poems such as Adam's Curse. And I would like to, when we turn to Crazy Jane talks to the bishop, talks with the bishop, there's an interesting sort of, Crazy Jane sort of wins that argument, even though she's down and homeless and poor, and the bishop is high and mighty. But Crazy Jane slapped some sort of hard-won wisdom on him, and I think it sort of is part of Yeats's sort of empathy for the plight of women. You think is that?
The poem Adam's Curse showed that he was sensitive to the plight of women. Like, they were not just objects, because it was based on a real dinner that he had with Maud and her sister Kathleen, and Maud had just come in from traveling and wore a dark dress and hadn't changed for dinner, and her sister still presented herself and dressed for dinner, and they both discussed to him that a woman had to labor to be beautiful. That was part of the deal, especially then.
Yeah.
So I think he knew that though she was a beautiful woman, being a beautiful woman was a double-edged sword.
Right. To be born woman is to know.
Yes.
It's a great line.
We must finish it.
That we must labor to be beautiful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then Maud and her sister learned that from their great aunt in Paris, who was educated Maud the way that Leslie Caron was in Gigi, by the grandmother and the great aunt.
Okay.
So Maud always, she ordered her clothes in Paris, and as did her sister.
Well, let's hear Crazy Jane Talks with the Bishop, read by Terry Donnelly. It's a short poem, which happens to be one of my favorite, and I'll tell you why after we've heard it.
I met the bishop on the road, and much said he and I. Those breasts are flat and fallen now, those veins must soon be dry. Live in a heavenly mansion, not in some foul sty. Fair and foul are near of kin, and fair needs foul, I cried. My friends are gone, but that's a truth, nor grave nor bed denied. Learned in bodily lowliness and in the heart's pride. A woman can be proud and stiff when on love intent, but love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. For nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent.
Yeah, I love the way, when Terry plays, as it were, that little sort of dialogue and tells that bishop off, she really lays it, like, sticks it to him. Fair needs foul, I cried. I think that line has a tremendous amount of sort of resonance throughout Yeats's work. The idea of the opposite, the dance from the dance. Let's do this. I want to ask you to tell our viewers where to buy the book. And
you can buy the book. The publisher is Or Books, so it's www.orbooks.com. And if you use the discount code IrishRep15, you'll get a 15% discount from the price.
Okay. All right. It's an absolutely wonderful book. I can't recommend it enough. And would Joe come back on for a moment so we can conclude together? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
It's been such a pleasure to get to know both of you and to be really immersed in these huge projects. I know we've only had a chance just to dip into them a little bit, but it's been, absolutely wonderful. And I hope that this evening inspires a lot of people to go out and buy the books and to to have the benefit of your scholarship and your insights. And I'm looking forward to your next projects. And thank you so much for joining. I also want to.
Yes, thank you, Rufus.
Yeah, I want to say again, thanks to the Irish Rep for those fabulous performances of the poems.
Yes.
It's really thrilling.
Yeah, they were absolutely great. We're going to go out with a Circus Animals Desertion. But before we do that, I just want to announce that there's an ongoing installation at the Rep itself called Poetic Reflections, Words Upon a Window Pane, a series of films from the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation featuring poets and actors reading poems from Ireland and beyond. These films are on display in the lobby and in the windows on West 22nd Street at the Rep, and will be available online in 3 parts. Part 1 is available now on YouTube, and Part 2 premieres on Monday, April 5th. And you'll learn more about it if you go to irishrep.org. So with that, I'd like us to go out with a great poem, Circus Animals Desertion, read by Colin McPhillamy. Good night.
I sought a theme and sought for it in vain. I sought it daily for 6 weeks or so. Maybe at last, being but a broken man, I must be satisfied with my heart, although winter and summer till old age began, my circus animals were all on show. Those stilted boys, that burnished chariot, lion and woman, and the Lord knows what. What can I but enumerate old themes? First, that sea rider Oisin led by the nose through 3 enchanted islands, allegorical dreams, vain gaiety, vain battle, vain repose, themes of the embittered heart, or so it seems, that might adorn old songs or courtly shows. But what cared I that set him on to ride? I, starved for the bosom of his fairy bride. And then a counter-truth filled out its play. The Countess Kathleen was the name I gave it. She, pity-crazed, had given her soul away, but masterful heaven had intervened to save it. I thought my dear must her own soul destroy, so did fanaticism and hate enslave it. And this brought forth a dream, and soon enough, the dream itself had all my thought and love. And when the fool and blind man stole the bread, Cuchulainn fought the ungovernable sea. Heart mysteries there, and yet, when all is said, it was the dream itself enchanted me. Character isolated by a deed, to engross the present and dominate memory. Players and painted stage took all my love, and not those things that they were emblems of. Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse, or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can. Old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
Thank you for being with us. We hope you enjoyed our program as much as we enjoyed putting it together.
Thank you again to Joe and Kim and Rufus and our wonderful actors, Sarah, Terry, Obi, Colin, and of course the wonderful Rory Duffy, who filmed it so beautifully. Thank you too to our staff, without whom we would be nothing.
If you're in the Chelsea area, please stop by our new installation, Poetic Reflections, Words Upon the Window Pane.
As you pass by our theatre, you've only to wave your hand and a poem will offer itself up to you. Might even be Yeats. Good night.
Good night, and thanks.